Welcome to Celtic Tomes, bringing you readings from bygone books.
Welcome to Celtic Tomes, bringing you readings by Gary and Ruth from the classic books of Celtic lore and study. Book 1, Chapter 4 of British Goblins, Welsh folklore, fairy mythology, legends and traditions.
Chapter 4, Mountain Fairies, including the Gwyllion, the Old Woman of the Mountain, the Black Mountain Gwyll, Exorcism by Knife, Occult Intellectual Powers of Welsh Goats, and the Legend of Cadwaladr's Goat. Section 1. The Gwyllion are female fairies of frightful characteristics who haunt lonely roads in the Welsh mountains and lead night wanderers astray. They partake somewhat of the aspect of Hecate of Greek mythology, who rode on the storm and was a hag of horrid guise. The Welsh word, gwyll, is variously used to signify gloom, shade, duskiness, a hag, a witch, a fairy, and a goblin. But its special application is to these mountain fairies of gloomy and harmful habits, as distinct from the Gwyllion of the forest glades and dingles, which are more often beneficent. The Gwyllion take on a more distinct individuality under another name, as the Gwyllion do in Mischievous Puck, and the Old Woman of the Mountain typifies all her kind. She is very carefully described by the prophet Jones, in the guise in which she haunted Llanhiddel Mountain in Monmouthshire. This was the semblance of a poor old woman, with an oblong four-cornered hat, ash-coloured clothes, her apron thrown across her shoulder, with a pot or wooden can in her hand, such as poor people carry to fetch milk with, always going before the spectator and sometimes crying, "Woe up!" This is an English form of a Welsh cry of distress, "Woob!" or "Wooboob!" Those who saw this apparition, whether by night or on a misty day, would be sure to lose their way, though they might be perfectly familiar with the road. Sometimes they heard her cry, "Woe up!" when they did not see her. Sometimes they went out by night to fetch coal, water, etc. The dwellers near that mountain would hear the cry very close to them, and immediately after they would hear it afar off, as if it were on the opposite mountain, in the parish of Aberystwyth. The popular tradition in that district was that the Old Woman of the Mountain was the spirit of one Juan White, who lived time out of mind in those parts, and was thought to be a witch, because the mountains were not haunted in this manner until after Juan White's death.
Juan Shui White is an old acquaintance of my boyhood,
writes to me a friend who was born some 30 years ago in Monmouthshire.
A ruined cottage on the Lasgarn Hill near Pontypool was understood by us boys to have been her house, and there she appeared at 12 p.m., carrying her head under her arm.
When people first lost their way and saw her before them, they used to hurry forward and try to catch her, supposing her to be a flesh and blood woman who could set them right. But they never could overtake her, and she on her part never looked back, so that no man ever saw her face. She's also been seen in the Black Mountain in Breconshire. Robert Williams of Langattock, Crickhowell, "a substantial man and of undoubted veracity," tells this tale. As he was travelling one night over part of the Black Mountain, he saw the old woman, and at the same time found he had lost his way. Not knowing her to be a spectre, he hallooed to her to stay for him, but receiving no answer, thought she was deaf. He then hastened his steps, thinking to overtake her, but the faster he ran, the further he found himself behind her, at which he wondered very much, not knowing the reason of it. He presently found himself stumbling in a marsh, at which discovery his vexation increased, and then he heard the old woman laughing at him with a weird, uncanny, crackling old laugh. This set him to thinking she might be a Gwyll, and when he happened to draw out his knife for some purpose, and the old woman vanished, then he was sure of it, for Welsh ghosts and fairies are afraid of a knife. Section 2. Another account relates that John ap John of Gwyllion set out one morning before daybreak to walk to Caerleon fair. As he ascended Milfrey Mountain, he heard a shouting behind him, as if it were on Bryn Mawr, which is a part of the Black Mountain in Breconshire. Soon after he heard the shouting on his left hand at Bwlch nearer to him, whereupon he was seized with a great fright, and began to suspect it was no human voice. He had already been wondering, indeed, what anyone could be doing at that hour in the morning, shouting on the mountainside. Still going on, he came up higher on the mountain, when he heard the shouting just before him, at Gilvac Fields, to the right, and now he was sure it was the old woman of the mountain, who purposed leading him astray. Presently he heard behind him the noise of a coach, and with it the special cry of the old woman of the mountain, viz., "Woe up!" Knowing very well that no coach could go that way, and still hearing its noise approaching nearer and nearer, he became thoroughly terrified, and running out of the road threw himself down upon the ground, and buried his face in the heath, waiting for the phantom to pass. When it was gone, out of hearing, he arose, and hearing the birds singing as the day began to break, also seeing some sheep before him, his fear went quite off. And this, says the Prophet Jones, was no profane, immoral man, but an honest, peaceable, knowing man, and a very comely person, moreover. Section 3. The exorcism by knife appears to be a very Welsh notion, though there is an old superstition of wide prevalence in Europe that to give to or receive from a friend a knife or a pair of scissors cuts friendship. I have even encountered this superstition in America. Once, an editorial friend at Indianapolis gave me a very handsome pocket knife, which he refused to part with, except at the price of 1 cent, lawful coin of the realm, asserting that we should become enemies without this precaution. In China, too, special charms are associated with knives, and a knife which has slain a fellow being is an invaluable possession. In Wales, according to Jones, the Gwyllion often came into the houses of the people of Aberystwyth, especially in stormy weather, and the inmates made them welcome, not through any love they bore them, but through fear of the hurts the Gwyllion might inflict if offended, by providing clean water for them and taking especial care that no knife or other cutting tool should be in the corner near the fire where the fairies would go to sit, for want of which care many were hurt by them. While it was desirable to exercise them when in the open air, it was not deemed prudent to display an inhospitable spirit towards any member of the fairy world. The cases of successful exorcism by knife are many, and nothing in the realm of fairy is better authenticated. There was Evan Thomas, who, travelling by night over the Bedwellty mountain towards the valley of Ebwy Fawr, where his house and estate were, saw the Gwyllion on each side of him, some of them dancing around him in fantastic fashion. He also heard the sound of a bugle horn winding in the air, and there seemed to be invisible hunters riding by. He then began to be afraid, but recollected his having heard that any person seeing Gwyllion may drive them away by drawing out a knife. So he drew out his knife, and the fairies vanished directly. Now Evan Thomas was an old gentleman of such strict veracity that he, on one occasion, did confess a truth against himself, when he was like to suffer loss thereby, and notwithstanding he was persuaded by some not to do it, yet he would persist in telling the truth to his own hurt. Should we find, in tracing these notions back to their source, that they are connected with Arthur's sword, Excalibur? If so, there again we touch the primeval world. Jones says that the Old Woman of the Mountain has, since about 1800, at least in South Wales, been driven into close quarters by the light of the gospel. In fact, she now haunts mines, or in the preacher's formal words, the coal pits and holes of the earth. Section 4. Among the traditions of the origin of the Gwyllion is one which associates them with goats. Goats are in Wales held in peculiar esteem for their supposed occult intellectual powers. They are believed to be on very good terms with the Tylwyth Teg and possessed of more knowledge than their appearance indicates. It is one of the peculiarities of the Tylwyth Teg that every Friday night they comb the goats' beards to make them decent for Sunday. Their association with the Gwyllion is related in the legend of Cadwaladr's goat. Cadwaladr owned a very handsome goat, named Jenny, of which he was extremely fond, and which seemed equally fond of him. But one day, as if the very diawl possessed her, she ran away into the hills, with Cadwaladr tearing after her, half mad with anger and affright. At last his Welsh blood got so hot, as the goat eluded him again and again, that he flung a stone at her, which knocked her over a precipice, and she fell, bleating, to her doom. Cadwaladr made his way to the foot of the crag. The goat was dying, but not dead, and licked his hand, which so affected the poor man that he burst into tears, and sitting on the ground took the goat's head on his arm. The moon rose, and still he sat there. Presently he found that the goat had become transformed to a beautiful young woman, whose brown eyes, as her head lay on his arm, looked into his in a very disturbing way. "Ah, Cadwaladr," said she, "have I at last found you?" Now Cadwaladr had a wife at home, and was much discomfited by this singular circumstance. But when the goat, an hour maiden, arose, and putting her black slipper on the end of a moonbeam, held out her hand to him, he put his hand in hers, and went with her. As for the hand, though it looked so fair, it felt just like a hoof. They were soon on the top of the highest mountain in Wales, and surrounded by a vapoury company of goats with shadowy horns. These raised a most unearthly bleating about his ears. One, which seemed to be the king, had a voice that sounded above the din, as the castle bells of Carmarthen used to do long ago above all the other bells in the town. This one rushed at Cadwaladr, and butting him in the stomach, sent him toppling over a crag, as he had sent his poor nanny goat. When he came to himself after his fall, the morning sun was shining on him, and the birds were singing over his head. But he saw no more of either his goat or the fairy she had turned into, from that time to his death.
That was Chapter 4 of British Goblins, Welsh Folklore, Fairy Mythology, Legends and Traditions by Wirt Sikes. A link to the full text can be found in the show notes, as well as a full list of the names and words that have appeared in this chapter. You'll find the show notes at celtictomes.libsyn.com. That's libsyn.com. If you'd like to leave a comment on this chapter, hop over to our show notes and leave us your feedback. If you've enjoyed this podcast, why not try our sister podcast, the Celtic Myth Pod Show, which brings the stories of ancient Celts to life with narrative and drama, as well as bringing you modern Celtic music, stories and information. Find the Celtic Myth Pod Show in all the places where the best podcasts hang out, or on our website at celticmythpodshow.com. You've been listening to Celtic Tomes, read by Gary and Ruth. Our theme music is Gander in the Pretty Hole by Slauncher, and a link to their music can be found in the show notes at celtictomes.libsyn.com. This podcast has been produced by the Celtic Myth Show.